We like to imagine evolution as this neat branching diagram in textbooks, but fossils like these suggest something messier, more experimental, more chaotic. Like Earth was running body plan prototypes for hundreds of millions of years, and most of them failed. And occasionally, one of those forgotten prototypes resurfaces, just long enough to remind us that the story of life isn't finished. And maybe it's not nearly as organized as we'd like to believe. And before we go deeper into the abyss, quick reality check. Less than 20% of you watching are subscribed, which means 80% of you are just floating through the fossil record like unidentified organisms. If you made it this far, you're clearly into this stuff. So hit subscribe. It genuinely helps push videos like this into more feeds, and the algorithm, unlike these fossils, actually does respond to patterns. All right, now let's talk about a time period that makes the Cambrian explosion look organized. We're going further back, before trilobites, before complex predators, before anything that feels familiar. Welcome to the Ediacaran, and more specifically, the Ediacara biota. This was the first time in Earth's history when large, macroscopic life starts showing up in the fossil record. And instead of recognizable animals, we get this soft-bodied, quilted, disc-like, frond-like, mattress-looking organisms that don't cleanly connect to anything alive today. It was so bizarre that one researcher basically said, "You know what? I'm just grouping these together. That's how confusing they are." Now, among this already strange lineup, one genus stands out in a way that almost feels unfair. Let me introduce you to Namacalathus. If you've played Elden Ring, imagine one of its bosses, but as a fleshy, calcified tree growing out of the seafloor. That's the vibe. When its fossils were first discovered, researchers weren't even sure they were looking at an animal. It resembled some kind of alien dwelling, like something another organism would live inside. It had a stalk. At the top, a cup-like structure, and strange openings perforating its surface. But then scientists analyzed its material. Calcified. Hard. This wasn't a plant. This wasn't a fungus. This was an animal. And not just any animal. It represents some of the earliest evidence we have of skeletal structures in the fossil record. Which means, while other life was still soft and squishy, this thing had armor. And it only gets worse. Later discoveries revealed what likely covered its body. Rows of tentacle-like structures. Spines. Grasping extensions that look less like peaceful filter feeders and more like something you'd designed to defend itself, or shred anything that drifted too close. And those openings I mentioned? They weren't just holes. They were biological windows, varying wildly in shape. Circles, hearts, hexagons, even crescent moon shapes, trypophobia nightmare fuel. In life, they would have been filled with soft organic tissue. What did they do? We don't know. Feeding, filtering, respiration. Still debated, and just to make it even stranger, this organism could adjust its size depending on environmental conditions. It appears across different habitats, though it seemed particularly comfortable in deeper marine settings, including abyssal plains. So here's the big question. What was it? At first glance, it resembles coral, but detailed studies suggest it was too complex to be a simple coral organism. So again, we're left with probably an animal. That's it. And Namacalathus isn't alone. Take Dickinsonia. It looks like a bath mat, or a ribbed rug someone left on the ocean floor. Except it was alive. It grew. It moved. And for decades, scientists argued over whether it was a fungus, a protozoan colony, or even a failed experiment in multicellularity. Only relatively recently did chemical analysis suggest it was indeed an animal. Then there are other quilted, segmented enigmas like Vendia and Sprigina. So many strange, flat, ribbed organisms appeared during this time that researchers eventually proposed grouping many of them into a single phylum, Proarticulata. That's basically scientific language for they look related. Probably. But here's what makes them truly infuriating. They look symmetrical. Perfectly organized, clean, balanced, and then you look closer. The segments don't mirror exactly. One side is offset from the other. The lines don't line up. It's like evolution almost committed to symmetry, and then changed its mind at the last second. Why? Developmental constraints? Evolutionary experimentation? A completely different body plan logic we don't understand? We don't know. And that's the pattern. Taxonomy? Debated. Morphology? Debated. Lifestyle? Debated. Some researchers think many of these organisms didn't even have mouths in the traditional sense. Others propose they absorbed nutrients directly through their surfaces. Some may have been sessile. Others left trackways suggesting movement. But nothing is universally agreed upon, which leads to a slightly uncomfortable realization. For a significant stretch of Earth's history, complex life existed in forms that do not neatly connect to modern animals. Entire ecosystems made up of body plans that may have no living descendants. Not primitive versions of modern animals, not early prototypes of fish or arthropods, but possibly completely separate experiments. And most of them disappeared before the Cambrian explosion rewrote the rules, which raises a question that's honestly kind of unsettling. What if the evolutionary tree isn't just branches growing upward? What if it's mostly branches that were cut off, and we're just one of the few that survived? Absolutely unacceptable. And here's the part that makes it even crazier. Some researchers think many of those Ediacaran organisms may not have left any descendants at all, which, if true, means they were evolutionary dead ends. Entire body plans, entire ecosystems. Gone. No modern relatives, no legacy. Just a strange biological experiment that failed and vanished. And honestly, given how unsettling some of them look, good riddance. But if you think the weirdness has peaked, it hasn't. Because somehow, there's an even older chapter that raises even bigger questions. To get there, you have to rewind not hundreds of millions of years, but 2.1 billion years. Welcome to the Paleoproterozoic, specifically the Orosirian, a time when Earth barely resembled the world we know. Continents were forming, oxygen levels were fluctuating, the planet was chemically unstable, and in what is now Gabon, Africa, scientists discovered something that shouldn't exist. The Francevillian biota, in black shale deposits dated to around 2.1 billion years ago, researchers found large, organized, disc-like structures. Some circular, some elongated, others shaped like tubes, strings of pearls, even flower-like forms. And here's the problem. No one is completely sure they're even fossils. When they were first described, researchers proposed they were colonial, multicellular organisms, possibly even eukaryotes. That's a massive claim, because that would push complex life back over 400 million years earlier than previously accepted. Not everyone agreed. Some argued these shapes were just inorganic mineral formations. Others said they were artifacts created during rock alteration. And honestly, when you're dealing with something over 2 billion years old, proving it was alive is incredibly difficult. But more recent studies have strengthened the biological case. Isotopic analysis showed enrichment in zinc, a potential indicator of eukaryotic metabolism. Some researchers have even argued that the environmental conditions there were uniquely suited for early complex life. So imagine that. A discovery so old, so controversial, that we are still debating whether we're looking at life or geology. And if they were alive, they likely weren't swimming predators or active hunters. Given their shapes and lack of locomotion evidence, they were probably planktonic or benthic organisms living in shallow marine environments, possibly delta systems that were rare at the time, which makes it even more mind-bending. Complex life may have emerged, flourished, and then disappeared entirely, long before the Cambrian explosion ever happened. But here's the twist. Sometimes fossils cause chaos not because they look alien, but because they look almost familiar. Let me introduce you to Nectocaris. Discovered in 1910 in the famous Burgess Shale, it was originally described as a kind of stretched-out shrimp. Its name literally means swimming shrimp. But even then, something felt off. It shared similarities with arthropods, but its fins were inverted compared to what we'd expect. The original describer couldn't confidently classify it, so he left it unassigned. Years later, an Italian paleontologist studied photographs of the fossil and proposed something radical. It was a chordate. He pointed to a possible tail fin and what he interpreted as a notochord, and that idea stuck for over 20 years, until 2010. That's when more than 90 new, exceptionally preserved specimens were discovered. And suddenly, the shrimp didn't look like a shrimp at all. It looked like this, a squid-like creature. 2 tentacles, a flat, kite-shaped body, large stalked eyes, and strangely, no obvious mouth, except for a large funnel-like structure that may have functioned as a reversible proboscis, which is both impressive and mildly horrifying. Now that it looked like a cephalopod, the mystery seemed solved. Researchers proposed it was an early cephalopod, possibly the earliest ever discovered, predating known examples by about 30 million years. That would have been huge. Except, its anatomy didn't match what we know about cephalopod evolution. It was like finding a modern human fossil before the earliest primates. The timeline didn't make sense, so the cephalopod hypothesis was eventually rejected, and just like that, back to square one. In 2019, a similar fossil was discovered and named Nectocotis, thought to be closely related. Together, they form a controversial, still poorly understood group often referred to as the Nectocaridids, which is scientific code for, we know they're related to each other. Beyond that, we're working on it. And that's kind of the theme of this entire journey. Sometimes fossils are confusing because they look nothing like modern life. Sometimes they're confusing because they look too much like something modern, but at the wrong time. And sometimes we can't even agree if we're looking at life at all. We like to think science has mapped out the tree of life neatly, but the fossil record keeps handing us organisms that don't fit the tree. Branches with no roots. Roots with no branches. Entire chapters that may have ended before the story we recognize even began. Which makes one thing very clear. Life's history isn't a straight line. It's a graveyard of experiments, and we just happen to be one that worked. Thanks for watching, and until next time.